What if I told you that the most dangerous moment in Roman history wasn't a battle, it was a bath? Close your eyes and step into a marble chamber thick with steam and the cloying sweetness of imported oils. You are close enough to hear the breathing of the most dangerous man alive. For a decade, you filled his golden goblet, smiled when he smiled, and kept your face perfectly still every time he casually waved a hand and ended someone's life. His name is Commodus, Emperor of Rome, self-proclaimed living god. And right now, just beyond a curtain of vapor, he's soaking in his private bath completely relaxed, completely unaware that his world is about to end. Minutes ago, you discovered something you were never supposed to find. A small wax tablet tucked beneath a pile of correspondence, covered in neat handwriting. It's a kill list, names scratched into wax, each paired with a method of execution. You scan the column and your stomach drops. Asterisk, your own name stares back at you. Scheduled for sunrise. Ask, you are Marcia lover, confidant, the one woman the emperor trusts above all others. And now you have maybe 60 minutes before the most powerful man on earth steps out of that water, dries his hands, and signs your death warrant. Beyond the palace walls, Rome buzzes with celebration. The city is counting down to a brand new year, January 1st, 193 AD. But if Commodus walks out of that bath breathing, you'll never feel daylight again. Not tomorrow, not ever. You've seen what he does to people who disappoint him. The iron hooks, the public spectacles, the slow, deliberate humiliation designed to make an example of anyone who dares defy a living god. But standing here now, heart hammering against your ribs, you realize something crucial. Asterisk, this is bigger than saving your own skin. For over a decade, this man has hollowed out the greatest civilization on the planet. He's bled the treasury dry, poisoned the military command, and turned Rome's arenas into slaughterhouses for his personal entertainment. How does a woman with no army, no title, and no political power end up holding the fate of an empire in her trembling hands? To answer that, we need to rewind. We need to walk through every twisted chapter that brought Rome to its knees and Commodus to this bathtub. Forget the polished Hollywood version. Forget the brooding tragic prince from the movies. The real Commodus was something far worse, not just a tyrant, but a predator who genuinely believed the gods had chosen him to terrorize humanity. Tonight, we trace the entire arc. From a boy raised in gold who ordered a man burned alive, to the monster soaking behind that wall, through fire and sand and feasts, soaked in blood, all the way to the moment Marcia finally decides. Before we descend into this darkness together, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you're watching from right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take 1 second to do it, because nobody tells dark history like we do. Asterisk, this is the true story of the emperor who called himself Hercules, and the 3 desperate people who decided that gods can bleed. To understand what happened in that steam-filled room, you need to go back more than 2 decades to a cold morning when a small boy woke up surrounded by silk and genuinely believed the entire world existed to serve him. Commodus wasn't some general's son raised in a border fortress. He was born inside the imperial palace itself, the child of Marcus Aurelius the emperor, history would later call the philosopher king. From his very first cry, an army of servants materialized around him. Nurses, guards, tutors, entertainers, slaves whose only purpose was to keep this one child comfortable, fed, and never bored. No boy in Roman history had ever been so completely shielded from reality. He wasn't the only child. Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina buried several sons and daughters before they reached adulthood, the way so many Roman parents did in that brutal age. Every tiny coffin broke the emperor a little more, and every child who survived became something almost sacred. Commodus entered the world as a twin, but his brother didn't last long. That left him carrying a double weight on his small shoulders. He was both the cherished heir and the living reminder that fate could snatch everything away without warning. Marcus poured resources into shaping the boy. Philosophers, military veterans, masters of rhetoric all paraded through his rooms day after day, filling his head with history, ethics, and the mechanics of command. On parchment, the plan looked flawless. This child had every advantage a future emperor could ask for. Asterisk, But something inside him rejected all of it. His tutors noticed early. Where other children recoiled at suffering, Commodus leaned in. A wounded animal didn't make him cry, it made him curious. He wanted to know how long the creature would last. When a household slave fumbled and broke something, he didn't pout the way children do. He demanded consequences. Real ones. The palace staff traded nervous glances and told each other that his temper burned hot and faded quickly. But underneath those outbursts sat something colder than anger, something that made even battle-scarred veterans uneasy. The moment that turned whispers into genuine fear came when Commodus was roughly 11 years old. He'd spend the entire day performing the role of a young prince reciting prepared speeches, studying troop formations scratched into wax, sitting through another grinding lecture about virtue and duty. All he wanted now was his bath. For a Roman aristocrat, bathing wasn't a chore, it was ritual. Steam, scented oils, the careful scraping of skin, and above all water heated to exactly the right temperature. Commodus walked in expecting perfection. What he got was lukewarm water. Maybe the furnace hadn't been stoked properly. Maybe someone miscounted the minutes. Whatever the reason, the water was too cool, and the boy didn't simply complain. He erupted. His voice bounced off the tiled walls as he screamed for whoever was responsible. Faces appeared in the doorway, drained of color. The furnace attendant, a man caked in soot and exhausted from feeding logs into the fire since dawn, was hauled before the prince. In any ordinary household, a child's tantrum would earn a scolding and be forgotten by dinner. But inside the imperial palace, the words of the heir carried the force of law. Commodus pointed at the shaking man and declared that he should be thrown into the furnace and burned alive. Not beaten, not reassigned. Burned. The adults in the room felt their insides go cold. This wasn't a child playing pretend. An order from the imperial bloodline, even from a boy, had real teeth. Nobody wanted to find out what would happen if they refused. So the attendants stalled. They bowed, praised the prince's sense of justice, and marched the furnace work out of sight. Then, desperate to save the man's life without openly defying the boy, they improvised. They brought Commodus to the furnace chamber, shielded his view just enough, and hurled bundles of raw wool drenched in animal fat into the flames. The grease ignited with a thick, stomach-turning stench. Smoke billowed. One of the attendants let out a convincing scream of agony. Commodus stood there, breathing in the reek of burning fat, and believed he'd watched the man die on his command. He didn't tremble. He didn't turn away. He didn't ask a single question about whether the punishment matched the offense. He simply accepted that a lukewarm bath had been corrected by a human bonfire, and walked back to his evening as though he'd swatted an insect. A sense of feeling horrified the palace staff far more than any burst of rage ever could. Rome had seen angry emperors and paranoid emperors. It had not seen a child look at a supposed execution the way someone looks at a repaired leak. The secret might have stayed buried inside those walls. But in a palace crawling with servants, nothing stays hidden forever. At some point, Commodus discovered the truth. Maybe a guard drank too much and let it slip. Maybe a terrified slave confessed under pressure. However it happened, the boy learned that no one had actually burned. And his reaction told you everything you needed to know about what was growing inside him. He wasn't embarrassed. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't feel an ounce of relief that a life had been spared. He ordered the furnace worker killed, for real, and then turned his anger on the men who had dared to trick him. Marcus Aurelius, fighting Germanic tribes along the frozen banks of the Danube, eventually heard the story. For a man who spent his private hours writing about mercy, self-discipline, and the fragility of life, this was devastating. He'd already worried that the comforts of the palace were making his son soft. Now he confronted something far worse. Not softness, emptiness. A void where compassion was supposed to live. He still loved the boy. He still believed he could steer him. But the furnace story rippled through the court like poison, and everyone who heard it understood the same thing. The future emperor of Rome didn't merely lack restraint. He lacked the ability to feel for another human being. Marcus responded the only way he knew how. He pulled Commodus out of the marble cocoon and dragged him to the frontier into the camps, where Roman legions bled and froze fighting barbarian warbands. The idea was simple: Show the boy real suffering. Let him see mud and disease and men missing limbs. Let him stand before soldiers who had sacrificed everything for the eagle standard and understand that ruling meant carrying the weight of other people's lives. Ask wanted hardship to crack open something human inside his son. Ask Womba a completely different lesson. He discovered that even as a teenager, armed men dropped to their knees when he appeared. He realized that the same voice that had once commanded a single slave could move entire legions. He loved the salutes, the rigid formations, the crash of armor as thousands of soldiers acknowledged his presence. The lectures about sacrifice and duty rolled right off him. The raw feeling of dominance soaked in. He enjoyed barking orders at grizzled veterans and watching them scramble. Asterisk, for Marcus, the frontier was a classroom. For Commodus, it was a taste of unlimited power. Late at night in those campaign tents, Marcus sat alone and wrote the reflections the world would eventually know as the Meditations. He told himself to be patient, to accept what the universe placed in front of him, to love his son as he was, not as he wished him to be. But the gap between the boy and the philosopher's dream kept widening. Marcus still refused to give up. He elevated Commodus to co-emperor while the boy was barely old enough to shave, hoping that the gravity of shared power would force maturity. He brought him into Senate sessions where grey-haired men debated taxation and border policy. He seated him at diplomatic receptions for foreign kings. Every move was designed to say the same thing: you are the future. Learn to carry it. But behind the polite nod and the practiced smile, Marcus could feel his son's restlessness. Commodus wanted the throne, not the responsibilities that came with it. The glory, not the grind. Ask. When Marcus Aurelius finally died in the spring of 188 AD, somewhere near the Danube, the empire didn't collapse. It simply changed hands. Ast. Overnight, a 19-year-old who had never been told no in his life became the sole master of a dominion stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the Egyptian desert. The Senate hoped that seasoned advisors would keep him in check. The people hoped the philosopher's son would govern with wisdom. The army hoped he would be generous and strong. None of them fully understood the kind of man who had just wrapped his fingers around the most powerful office on earth. At first, Commodus did something that looked almost merciful. He abandoned the brutal, grinding wars along the northern border and headed straight back to Rome. Plenty of citizens were exhausted by years of fighting. Peace sounded wonderful. Ask. Commodus didn't end the campaign out of compassion for the dying. He ended it because the frontier was uncomfortable. Hask. He wanted heated marble under his feet, not frozen mud. He wanted perfumed baths, not canvas tents. He let his generals sign treaties his father would have torn apart all so he could get home faster. Once inside Rome, Commodus walked into a system designed to consume every hour of an emperor's day. Petitions from citizens, judicial hearings, provincial reports, treasury summaries, letters from governors begging for guidance. Hask. He glanced at the mountain of obligations and pushed nearly all of it onto his inner circle. Hask. Why endure tedious Senate debates when he could lounge with performers and companions? Why squint at financial records when there were chariot races and private spectacles to enjoy? Let the bureaucrats and prefects worry about the machinery. He would enjoy the throne. If that had been the whole story, history might have filed him away as just another indulgent emperor. Disappointing, but not unique. Rome had survived lazy rulers before. What twisted his reign into something genuinely monstrous wasn't the laziness itself. It was what filled all those empty, unchallenged hours. Surrounded every waking moment by courtiers who needed his favor to keep their wealth in their heads, Commodus started believing the flattery. They didn't just tell him he was powerful, they told him he was chosen, anointed, carved by the heavens in a way no Roman leader had ever been. Ask. And that's where the obsession with godhood took root. Previous emperors had been deified after death, given temples and offerings as a formality. A few had flirted with divine status while still breathing. Commodus didn't want subtle hints. He wanted outright worship. He latched onto the myth of Hercules, the legendary strongman who strangled beasts and conquered monsters with nothing but muscle and a wooden club. Commodus looked at that figure and saw himself staring back. Invincible. Savage. Beyond mortal limits. He started appearing before the public draped in a lion skin, bare-chested, gripping an enormous club as though he'd just walked out of the myth himself. Imperial coins were minted showing, not an emperor, but Hercules Romanus, the Roman Hercules, fusing the state with legend. Asterisk, to question any of it was to challenge a god, and challenging a god meant death. But symbols alone couldn't satisfy him. Commodus ordered the colossal statue that stood near the amphitheatre, the towering bronze figure originally associated with Nero, to be remodeled. Workers removed the old head and replaced it with his own likeness, crowned with the rays of the sun. Citizens who had spent their entire lives passing one face on that monument now had to look up every single day and see Commodus gazing down at them, his shadow stretching across the arena and into the streets like the arm of a god reaching over the city. He didn't stop at statues. The calendar itself was rewritten. Months that had carried their names since the founding of Rome were stripped and rechristened with his titles, turning the passage of time into an endless repetition of his identity. He toyed with renaming Rome itself, rebranding the Eternal City as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. Legions, grain fleets, official records all were stamped with variations of his name until every document, every ship, every formation echoed the same message. Everything exists because of me. Everything belongs to me. But even the worship started to feel hollow. Being told he was a god was no longer enough. Asterisk, he didn't just want to hear about his own power. He wanted to feel it, to perform it in front of thousands of witnesses who couldn't look away. And in Rome, there was only one stage grand enough for that kind of spectacle. The arena. When being worshipped on parchment and in marble stopped feeding the hunger, Commodus went looking for the one place in Rome where no one could close their eyes. The amphitheatre, the building the world now calls the Colosseum, had served emperors for generations as a tool of public control. Free grain, exotic animals, staged combat, all designed to keep the masses loyal and distracted. But every emperor before him had ruled the games from a distance, watching from the imperial balcony like a patron overseeing his investment. Commodus had no interest in watching. He intended to be the spectacle. At first, the rumors were almost too bizarre to believe. Word leaks that the emperor had been fighting as a gladiator behind closed doors inside private training grounds where no citizen could witness the shame. Gladiators occupied one of the lowest rungs of Roman society. They were slaves, condemned criminals, or men so desperate they'd sold their own freedom for a meal. For the most powerful man in the known world to pick up their weapons and imitate their trade was an insult to every institution the empire had built. Senior senators grumbled that it degraded the office of emperor itself. Commodus didn't care. He loved the weight of a blade in his fist and the fantasy of a crowd screaming his name. Then he stopped hiding. He announced that he would fight publicly, not as the dignified ruler presiding over the entertainment, but as a competitor stepping onto the sand. Announcements circulated through the city. The population could barely process what they were hearing, yet when the day arrived, there he stood, Commodus, wrapped in the costume of Hercules, feet planted on blood-stained ground, while tens of thousands of Romans held their breath. The senators sat rigid in their front row seats, faces drained of colour, knowing that if anything went sideways, their necks would be the first on the block. None of it was real combat. Commodus never once risked his life. Every opponent who entered the arena against him had been hand-picked and hobbled. Some were chained so they could barely move. Others carried training swords made of wood, useless against his real armor. A few had been drubbed beforehand, stumbling onto the sand half-conscious. When he hunted wild animals, he did it from elevated platforms or behind heavy barriers, firing arrows from a safe distance where no claw or tooth could reach him. There was zero danger, only theatre. The official tallies later boasted that he competed hundreds of times. Some ancient accounts pushed the number past 700. Every single appearance was staged as a monumental event, and he compensated himself like a championship athlete. The imperial treasury was forced to pay roughly 1 million sesterces per performance directly into his personal accounts. That fortune was extracted from taxes, squeezed from provinces already stretched to breaking, taken from ordinary citizens who would never benefit from a single coin. The empire hemorrhaged wealth so one man could cosplay as a hero. From where Commodus stood, the adoration seemed genuine. The stadium erupted every time he raised his weapon. The crowd chanted every title he'd given himself. They pleaded for mercy on behalf of beaten opponents, so he could grant it with a magnanimous wave and look godlike. But anyone who studies the sources understands why the applause never faltered. Soldiers and informants were seeded throughout the audience. Asquith, every face in those stands knew that one wrong expression could be a death sentence. A visible wince, a look of obvious revulsion, even turning your head at the wrong second, any of it could be noticed, reported, and punished. So people clapped until their palms were raw and their smiles ached. The senators endured the deepest degradation. Commodus made them sit in the front rows so close they could feel warm droplets of blood land on their togas, so close they could count every stage blow. These were men who had led armies, administered entire regions of the empire, brokered peace between warring nations. Now they were a captive audience, forced to watch their emperor play dress-up with real swords and rigged victims. They couldn't leave, they couldn't object, they could only sit under their ceremonial wreaths and sweat. Survival demanded creativity. Roman historians record that senators began chewing laurel leaves during the performances, clenching them between their teeth to keep their faces in constant motion. If disgust or horror twisted their features, the chewing gave them cover. It was the leaves, not the revulsion, that explained any grimace. Others threw themselves into exaggerated applause, clapping with manic energy to disguise clenched jaws and tight throats. Every movement in those front rows was a survival calculation. How to look entertained while your stomach turns inside out. One performance branded itself into the memory of every senator present. Commodus had an ostrich dragged into the arena. With one theatrical swing, he severed its head. The long neck convulsed, the head hanging by a thread of sinew. Then, still gripping the grotesque trophy, he walked directly toward the senators. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He raised the twitching head and swept his free hand slowly across the row of seated men, drawing an invisible line from the severed neck to theirs. Ask. The message required no translation. Your head separates from your body just as easily. Ask. Somewhere in the stands, one senator cracked. Nervous, desperate laughter bubbled up out of him, the kind of sound a person makes when horror overwhelms every other response. He tried to smother it behind his hand, but others noticed. That senator did not survive the year. His appetite for cruelty didn't stop at rigged fights and animal massacres. He treated the arena as a personal workshop for inventing new forms of humiliation and death. Exotic creatures were shipped in from the farthest corners of the empire: lions, leopards, hippopotamuses, elephants, all paraded into the sand and butchered for the crowd. The audience marveled at his precision, but the atmosphere was toxic. These weren't hunts born from necessity or tradition. They were theatrical killings staged for one man's entertainment. Asterisk. The darkest chapter came when he turned his attention to the people Rome had already forgotten. Asterisk. The city's poorest and most vulnerable citizens, people living with missing limbs, spinal deformities, and other visible disabilities, survived on the margins, begging outside temples and bathhouses. Commodus didn't see them as human beings deserving of compassion. Asterisk. He saw raw material. Asterisk. He ordered a group of them seized from the streets and dragged into the amphitheater. To complete the grotesque production, his attendants fastened crude tails to their bodies' lengths of rope or fabric designed to resemble serpents. These people were shoved onto the sand in front of a crowd that had gone completely silent. Then Commodus appeared, once again costumed as Hercules, club raised high. He announced to the stadium that he was about to destroy monsters. Asterisk. There was no contest. There was no resistance. Hask! He bludgeoned them one by one, crushing skulls and breaking bodies while thousands of spectators watched. The crowd understood perfectly that these were ordinary citizens, not mythical beasts. Asterisk. They cheered anyway. They cheered because the alternative was becoming the next body on the sand. When the last swing landed, the arena floor was slick with the blood of people whose only crime was existing in a body. Commodus found useful as a prop. Their remains were hauled away. Official accounts praised the emperor's heroic triumph over unnatural creatures. No one in any position of authority dared state the obvious truth. The ruler of the civilized world had beaten defenseless citizens to death in broad daylight and called it mythology. Ashk. By this point, the arena, as horrifying as it was, only told half the story. What Commodus performed in front of screaming thousands was grotesque. Kah! What happened behind the sealed doors of the imperial palace was worse. Ugh. Inside those walls, day and night blurred into an endless rotation of feasting, excess, and casual violence. Commodus kept an enormous harem. Ancient writers describe hundreds of companions, men and women, collected from across the empire. Some were slaves purchased at market. Others were the children of respectable families who had no power to refuse when the emperor's agents came calling. Once they passed through the palace gates, they lost everything: their autonomy, their dignity, their names. Commodus organized them according to his whims, assigning them roles from mythology, or dressing them in costumes that amused him. They weren't partners, they were living furniture. The courtiers who attended his evening gatherings witnessed scenes that would never appear in any official record. Tables sagged under mountains of food while musicians played and dancers performed beneath flickering torchlight. Commodus drank without restraint, and alcohol didn't soften him. It sharpened the cruelty. He would order members of his harem to perform degrading acts in front of assembled guests, watching faces for any flicker of discomfort. If someone looked uneasy, he filed it away. That person might be the next one humiliated. He took particular pleasure in inverting the power structure. Men who technically held the highest offices in the empire could be reduced to jesters at a single command. One notorious incident involved his own praetorian prefect, the officer personally responsible for the emperor's safety and the most powerful military figure in the capital. In front of a room full of guests, Commodus ordered this man to strip naked and dance while holding small cymbals, rattling and swaying, while every eye in the room burned into him. The prefect couldn't refuse. Refusal was death. So he danced, face flushed with humiliation, while his emperor sat back and laughed. These episodes weren't entertainment, they were demolition. If the commander of the emperor's own guard could be turned into a joke on command, what protection did rank or achievement offer anyone else? The lesson was absolute. Title, service, accomplishment, none of it shielded you from the emperor's impulses. One misread expression, 1 second of hesitation, and you could slide from honored guest to broken victim between one course of dinner and the next. The nights often ended in bloodshed. Commodus liked to weaponize uncertainty. Sometimes the final act of an evening banquet was a sudden execution. A slave who had spilled a cup of wine, a messenger who carried unfavorable news, a servant who moved a fraction too slowly. Any of them could be beaten, tortured, or killed right there on the dining room floor, while the remaining guests sat paralyzed, eyes fixed on their plates, praying they wouldn't be singled out next. Then there was his private fascination with the mechanics of dying. It wasn't enough for him to order death from a distance or stage it in the arena. He developed a deeply personal obsession with opening the human body, with watching life leave flesh in real time. Ancient sources describe him adopting the role of a physician in a grotesque parody of medicine. He would summon a servant, claim he wanted to examine some minor ailment, and then pick up actual surgical instruments. There was never any intention to heal. He made incisions to see what lay beneath the skin. He opened veins to observe the way blood moved. He pressed on fresh wounds to study how the victim reacted, watching the stages of shock and agony with the detached focus of a man studying an insect. Sometimes he prolonged the process, slowing the bleeding to extend the observation. Other times he grew bored and finished quickly. The outcome was always identical. Another corpse, another experiment concluded. For anyone who existed in his orbit, the world stopped making sense. The emperor, who called himself Hercules, protector of civilization, was also the man who might open your body with a scalpel after dessert, simply because he wanted to watch the light leave your eyes. There was no safe role. Concubine, guard, cook, senator summoned for a private meeting. If his mood was generous, you walked out with a gift. If his mood was dark, you were carried out through the service entrance.